This is a photograph of my grandfather, Squadron Leader Tony Farrell, who was one of the last survivors of RAF Bomber Command. He was part of an elite team of pathfinders. His Mosquito squadron flew in low and fast, lighting up military targets using bombs or flares. This provided an aiming point for the main bombing force. During World War II, he flew 80 missions, including an audacious low-level attack on Hitler's Eagle's Nest. At the end of the war, he took part in Operation Manna, where he marked selected sites in Holland with flares so cargo planes could deliver food and aid to starving Dutch civilians. Was my grandfather a hero? Well, that depends on your perspective. The British and French governments thought so, awarding him their highest honours for bravery. If you believe my grandfather was a hero, I invite you to ask yourself this. Were I a Japanese canine arthritis expert introducing my grandfather Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack on Pearl Harbor killing 2,403 US citizens, would you say he was a hero, or would your perspective shift? Over the next 40 minutes I'll present a series of facts about Librela. There will be no need to speculate or offer personal opinion, but I will quote key independent opinion leaders on NGF and drugs which affect it. Advance warning, much of this lecture describes collateral damage, friendly fire if you will, and in the end the only person who can decide if Librela's a hero or a villain is you. I wouldn't want to be described as a vulture. It's derogatory, it means to prey on misfortune. Vultures are ugly scavengers with none of the glamour of eagles or ospreys, but are they expendable? Well, during the 1990s we found out when Indian vulture populations were decimated, killed by the anti-inflammatory drug diclofenac. At the time, Indian farmers treated cattle with this cheap painkiller, but diclofenac, otherwise known as Voltaren, is lethal to vultures. 40 million disappeared, leaving 12 million tons of rotting cattle and water buffalo. Feral dogs moved in, their numbers increasing by 5 million. But many Indian feral dogs carried rabies. The demise of Indian vultures caused 47,000 excess rabies deaths and cost the Indian government $34 billion. The message is clear: ecosystems are complex, and labelling a component as expendable can have serious consequences. If not for the molecule prostaglandin E2, these two puppies wouldn't exist. PGE2 is a product of an inflammatory cascade abbreviated to COX. It opens an essential fetal blood vessel called the ductus arteriosus. If not for PGE2, puppies would be starved of oxygen before they were born. No PGE2, no puppy. But soon after birth, PGE2 assumes a new role, switching from hero to villain. Where there is pain, you'll find PGE2. Its presence at the scene of the crime made it a prime suspect and therapeutic target. Now, we can think of an inflammatory cascade like branching dominoes, and we can interfere upstream or downstream. Corticosteroids like prednisolone block the cascade upstream. Prednisolone can be very effective for arthritis pain. This study showed 6 weeks of low-dose prednisolone was safe and effective for people with a painful flare of hand osteoarthritis. Now, dogs don't have hands, of course, they have front feet. So do I use prednisolone for front foot arthritis in dogs? Well, the answer is yes, I use a similar protocol, and in my experience it often works very well. Now, we must remember that despite the name, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Metacam and Rimadyl are not powerful anti-inflammatories. If we want to treat severe non-suppurative inflammation, we can get control with corticosteroids to get our patients past a bump in the road and switch to non-steroidals later. Now, it's common knowledge that corticosteroids have 3 serious problems. Interfering with the inflammatory cascade upstream is overkill, a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Blocking inflammation upstream causes unwanted downstream side effects, including hunger, thirst, and weight gain. And importantly, corticosteroids produce a catabolic effect on cartilage, so they accelerate osteoarthritis. In reality, PGE2 is a jack of all trades, a keystone molecule, which explains why pharma companies developed drugs like Galliprant that work downstream. It's a bit like fishing for krill instead of tuna, but overfishing krill also has consequences because interactions within ecosystems are, as we've just seen, incredibly complex. But if we ask the fishing industry if there's plenty of krill, they'll say yes. So who tells the world that it's safe to target molecules like PGE2 and NGF, that the consequences of targeting them are overstated or unimportant? Well, the answer is, of course, drug companies who have billions at stake. This is not a conspiracy theory, it's a harsh reality. So keystone molecules like vultures are villains, but they're also heroes. Now here's an important question. Is NGF a keystone molecule? Well, it depends who you ask. Here's a 2018 review article published 3 years before Librela's European release. Obvious errors capture our attention. For example, I comes before E except after C. This mistake is obvious. Well, some statements are not errors, but they are misleading. I quote, "In adults, the main role of NGF shifts from trophic support of sensory and sympathetic neurons to modulation of nociceptive neuronal activity. In other words, like PGE2, it stops being a hero and starts being a villain." In 2018, the scientific community already knew plenty about potential harms of anti-NGF monoclonal antibodies. For example, like corticosteroids, they accelerated arthritis in rats and humans. Accelerated arthritis was entirely predictable. NGF, like PGE2, is a jack of all trades, a keystone molecule. It modulates bone and cartilage turnover, but this was not seen as a potential problem by the authors of this paper. Who were these unconcerned authors? Scan to the end of the paper and we'll find they're funded by NextVet and Zoetis, who subsequently acquired NextVet, and that made them the only company developing veterinary anti-NGF monoclonal antibodies. Perhaps we should take more care where we source our information. The canine osteoarthritis staging tool excluding radiography, abbreviated to COAST, is a detailed expert consensus statement. Taking X-rays adds expense, so these guidelines were published to help us select a treatment based on clinical suspicion. 6 of 9 experts recommended Librela as an appropriate first-line option for dogs with mild osteoarthritis. But scan to the end of the paper and you'll find that 6 of 9 experts received payments from Zoetis. One of the authors joined a popular Librela social media group and promoted this narrative without declaring his financial conflict of interest. So it's up to you to decide if this is or isn't okay. Should we accept Zoetis' negligible risk narrative at face value, or should we ask someone else? Dr. George Yankopoulos is Chief Scientific Officer at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. He was involved in the original neurotrophin cloning research. Here's some context. It's 2012. The FDA has put a hold on anti-NGF clinical trials due to accelerated joint destruction. Their independent pathologist described dramatic subluxations in some patients taking the human equivalent of Librela. So I quote, "There is a family of very related growth factors. An NGF that everybody is focusing on is working on a certain type of sensation, but not on proprioception. For any listeners who are unfamiliar, proprioception is scientific jargon for spatial awareness. Another factor, neurotrophin 3, is very specific and very important for proprioceptive function. And one sees some very dramatic dislocations and proprioceptor dysfunction in animals that are lacking NT3. It is very important to consider the possibility that some of these agents might have some effects on NT3. So this may not be purely an anti-NGF type of side effect that is leading to rapid progressive destruction of joints. This is a frank admission from an expert with skin in the game. At that time, this drug class, which included his own drug, fasinumab, was forecast to achieve $11 billion worth of sales by 2023. Other experts at the same meeting highlighted NGF polymorphism, which is jargon for genetic variation. Put simply, to some extent the effects and side effects are coded into our genes. This study illustrates an important point. Researchers followed recovering heroin addicts with 14 different genetic variations of NGF, and they identified a link between maintenance methadone doses and NGF genotype. Put another way, it would make no sense to copy someone else's drinking habits if their alcohol tolerance is much higher than ours. This important principle explains why drug companies who have dropped the human equivalents of Librela are developing targeted, almost personalized NGF drugs. This class will work downstream and will not be a sledgehammer cracking a nut. The reading list for my governing body, the European College of Veterinary Surgeons, includes 10 textbooks and 5 years of articles from 5 scientific journals. So I read about 2,600 papers in my 3.5-year residency. Since then my pace has slowed. These days I average 3 papers per week, bringing me to around 5,000 papers over 27 years. That's my base training. Now I'm currently writing a study on a specific aspect of Librela. I had to review 84 papers at 45 minutes per paper. That's 63 hours of reading. But I can't make conclusions based on reading. I must analyse, which takes me around 3 times longer. That's 190 hours or 23 8-hour working days for one specific aspect of Librela. Librela made its European debut in 2021 when I was living in COVID-free New Zealand. I wanted to return home to Great Britain for family reasons, so I had to decide should I get vaccinated. I read the excellent book A Shot to Save the World and selected papers, and I made an evidence-based conclusion. I was one of the first in line for the COVID vaccine when it arrived in New Zealand. Do I believe that people who made a different choice, for example Novak Djokovic, are less informed or less intelligent than me? Well, I certainly do not. But on average, anti-vaxxers self-identify as more informed and intelligent than people like me who had the shot. This is the current landscape. I'm an expert in canine arthritis by training, but I'm not the only expert. In my experience, experts by self-determination, like anti-vaxxers, have greater confidence in their knowledge of Librela than I do in mine. In osteoarthritis, we face a formidable foe. The number one killer of pet dogs in the Western world is cancer, but only 5 percentage points behind are musculoskeletal conditions, a group dominated by osteoarthritis. Arthritis pain is cited as the reason for euthanasia in 4 out of 10 dogs affected by elbow dysplasia. These are, I'm sure you'll agree, tragic statistics. I'm going to share the history of another tragic statistic. It's a story which teaches us a critical lesson. In 2008, at the height of the AIDS epidemic, a South African citizen died of an AIDS-related illness every 1.3 minutes. This tragedy captured the attention of Matthias Rath, a German doctor and vitamin salesman. According to him, the answer to the AIDS epidemic was not prescription antiretrovirals. They were part of a conspiracy to kill patients and make money, according to him. Stop AIDS genocide by the drugs cartel, read one headline. Why should South Africans continue to be poisoned with AZT? There is a natural answer to AIDS. And what was that natural answer? Well, according to Reuters, Rath's foundation distributed tens of thousands of pamphlets in poor South African townships urging HIV-positive people to use vitamins, i.e. Rath Foundation's products, instead of antiretroviral drugs. Tragically, the president of South Africa was an AIDS dissident. He supported the false claims, refused to implement proper treatment programs, leading to 343,000 preventable deaths. Misplaced faith in ineffective treatments is lethal. If we're showing up to a gunfight, we're going to need guns, and we have 4 at our disposal: weight loss, physical therapy, surgery, and prescription drugs, including joint injections. That's it. List complete. We have 4 big guns. But is there, as the Rath Foundation claimed for AIDS, a natural alternative? Here's one, I'll quote. For the owner question addressing degree of lameness, 50% of owners stated that their dog was improved. For veterinarians, 45% graded the dog as improved or less lame. Well, what was this treatment? It was an inactive placebo, and the caregiver placebo effect occurred 57% of the time. In other words, when we read a positive testimonial, according to this study, there's a nearly 6 out of 10 chance that the person describing their game changer would offer a positive review for a sugar pill. But the problem is that almost everyone sees the caregiver placebo effect as someone else's vulnerability. If you're thinking, when I say something works, it really works, you're not alone. The fact that risks and returns are closely coupled is a difficult concept for many who advocate for natural alternatives. While they routinely hype the benefits of their favoured products, pharmaceutical companies routinely downplay the risks of theirs. For example, Zoetis reported a 0.18% adverse event rate for Librela in an email to the global financial media group Investopedia. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and claiming we can is not helping. If I was Zoetis, this narrative that caregivers should choose natural alternatives instead of Librela is exactly what I'd want to hear. If the alternative to Librela is products with a negligible benefit, Zoetis can argue quite rightly that they don't meet a serious unmet need. I was 16 years old when I made my first journey into the world of alcohol. I literally made a schoolboy error, drinking a portion better suited to an experienced adult. My reward was an overnight stay in Kingston Hospital and 3 days of vomiting. What did I do next, you might ask? Did I choose to never drink alcohol again, as I'm obviously sensitive? Maybe I should have switched from my original choice of rum to vodka, or get my kicks from cocaine or heroin instead. If that sounds crazy, bear in mind that it's the very same logic applied to most dogs who vomit after their first exposure to our best painkillers, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Take Carprofen, Librela's stablemate, marketed by Zoetis under the trade name Rimadyl. It's been shown to slow progression of osteoarthritis, it works better the longer you use it, and side effects are less common after prolonged use. But 1 in 6 dogs vomit or get diarrhea when they start taking Rimadyl. Instead of writing off this class of painkillers, why not do what we do with alcohol? Start with a very low dose and gradually increase it over 4 to 6 weeks. Why switch to a drug class which accelerates arthritis? In 1985, Dr. Sheldon Summers, a preeminent professor of clinical pathology, made a statement designed to cast doubt on the link between smoking and lung cancer. Dr. Summers, who was funded by the Council for Tobacco Research, claimed that a statistical correlation between smoking and lung cancer did not definitively prove causation. His core argument was that smoking must be both necessary and sufficient for a causal relationship to exist. In other words, not all smokers develop lung cancer, and not all lung cancer patients smoke. The typical response to environmental changes like cigarette smoke or a drug follows a normal distribution. 95% of a population occupy the central bell-shaped area. Scientists who question the safety of smoking or a drug are looking for a shift in the curve, which can be surprisingly difficult to prove. Experts like Dr. Summers, who deny a shift in the curve, focus attention on the extremes. In the case of Librela, it might sound like this: my dog had no effect and/or serious side effects, or my dog had a miraculous effect and no side effects. People in the green group feel sorry for people in the red group, but they'd prefer it if the red group didn't make too much fuss in case red's actions end up denying green dogs a miraculous painkiller, which is completely understandable. If it feels like Librela is polarising opinion, this explains why. Meanwhile, the 95% are forgotten, which brings us back to the smoking argument. A smoker likes smoking, the smoker is questioned, their riposte, smoking doesn't harm me, anyway my gran smoked 50 a day and lived to 100. I've spent 27 years immersed in human and animal suffering. It's been a rewarding but stressful career. I take the suffering of others home with me, I think about it when I should be enjoying other things, and it keeps me up at night. My personal antidote is humour. I laugh to survive and I joke to endure. This is and always has been my identity. I'm not ashamed of my identity, which is why I share it with the public. So the first time I lectured on this subject, I submitted my normal quirky profile photo, which the course organiser changed without asking. They superimposed their own screenshot to cover my original photo. Is this okay? Well, again, it depends on our personal perspective. Some might argue that it was their Congress and therefore their right to alter my image to suit their preferences. If this is your current mindset, hold that thought because it will help you understand what comes next. Everyone loved Stanley. Words can't describe how sweet, lovable and brave he was. Stanley had 2 elbow problems, dysplasia and insufficiency fractures. I've published on both conditions and I'm a recognised world authority. Stanley's elbow problems were unlike anything I'd seen before, but they were absolutely consistent with what we know about how Librela works. Specifically, they were absolutely consistent with the accelerated joint destruction reported in humans and experimental animals. Whilst I was treating Stanley, a colleague asked for my help with another young Labrador with the same problem. The common denominator was Librela. Despite the efforts of an amazing specialist team, we lost the fight and Stanley lost his life. Obviously, I reported this as a serious adverse event, but just as my profile photo was changed, so too was my report. It said septic arthritis. But my report clearly stated that Stanley did not have septic arthritis. We performed many tests to rule it out. Perhaps the individual who changed my report made an honest mistake, or perhaps they thought that reassigning a diagnosis of septic arthritis might get Librela off the hook. But sadly, Stanley is not alone. Here's the European Medicines Agency's summary of adverse events to Librela, downloaded on August 28, 2024. There are 20,140 affected dogs, 2,735 musculoskeletal disorders, including 31 fractures. Legend has it that Stalin said 1 death is a tragedy, but 1 million deaths is just a statistic. Well, Stanley is not a statistic to me, his family, or the vets and nurses who tried to save him. Why am I here talking to you? Why do I endure abuse from both sides of the argument? 1 minute I'm in Zoetis' pocket, the next I'm an alarmist who's treating Zoetis unfairly. I tolerate this because Stanley and all the other Stanleys out there deserve a legacy of honesty. Dr. Maria Suarez Almazor was the chairperson of an FDA advisory committee who voted 19-1 against approving tanezumab, Librela's human equivalent, in 2021. I quote, "At most, the efficacy is just modest. It's only a 10% difference with non-steroidals. She points out that the number needed to treat is 10, which means you'd need to treat 10 patients to have a benefit in 1 compared to ibuprofen. Dr. Suarez Almazor wasn't the only expert who was unimpressed by the effect of this drug class. Compared with non-steroidals, many experts described the average effect as modest. Dr. Brendan Boyce, professor of pathology at the University of Rochester, said, "The efficacy seems to be limited to maybe 40 or so % of patients." And I think it's important that they figure out who these patients are. If the response occurs very early, within a week or 2 of the first injection, it may be that the 60% of patients who don't respond should not be given further treatment. These experts had substantial data to call upon, 41 studies spanning 15 years, including 17,000 patients. This is one of 3 studies which lasted over a year, comparing pain control from an anti-NGF drug and non-steroidals. Across 3 studies, around 3,000 patients received the anti-NGF drug tanezumab. The 10% benefit described by Dr. Suarez Almazor disappeared after 4 months. Now, we can't compare these results to Librela because its field trials didn't follow 3,000 dogs for over a year. Only 89 dogs received more than 3 doses, and there was no active control group. To illustrate the vast differences between human and veterinary anti-NGF drug trials, if the number of enrolled humans were a grapefruit, the number of enrolled dogs would be a grape, a 34-fold difference. Anti-inflammatory epidural injections can make a significant impact on dogs with low back pain. We give them to dogs as a course of 3, with the second and third injections acting as boosters. What if the first injection doesn't work very well? The second injection might produce a small additive effect. It might nudge our patient above an arbitrary threshold. If it does, we can argue that our patient is mathematically better. But I agree with Professor Boyce. If the first dose doesn't work, hidden adverse reactions become even more relevant. Risk must be balanced by benefit. In Librela's US field trial, the difference between Librela and an inactive placebo a month after the first treatment was 12%, a difference which was not statistically important. The second injection nudged them to 16%, which was statistically different, but the effect is still best described as modest. Unlike human trials, which showed a 10% difference against another painkiller, Librela's comparator was saline, i.e. water injections. But we still need to remember that there are miracle responders. We mustn't ignore them, but we do need to acknowledge that miracle responders are not sufficiently common to influence average outcome. The opioid crisis played an unwitting role in NGF-drugs history. Purdue Pharma were a major player in the crisis. Their drug Oxycontin was a very powerful painkiller, an excellent option for palliation in cancer patients perhaps, but it suffered the serious limitation of addiction. Purdue reaped $31 billion from Oxycontin based on a lie, misinterpretation of a 5-line letter to the New England Journal of Medicine written by a hospital doctor who said less than 1% of his patients treated with oral opioids became addicted. The result? Over 183,000 deaths and millions of ruined lives. This was the backdrop when the first clinical trial of an anti-NGF painkiller was published in 2010. 7 out of 10 patients in that study developed adverse events, but most were described as mild. Pain control was good, and anti-NGF was hailed as promising, but critically, thanks to Purdue Pharma, the FDA were watching this space. Serious side effects did happen. 3 companies, Pfizer, Regeneron and Johnson & Johnson, all reported accelerated joint degeneration in a small proportion of patients. Critically, 7 out of 10 were clinically silent, side effects were dose-related, and 2 to 3 times more likely in patients combining nonsteroidals and anti-NGF injections. The FDA imposed a sophisticated risk mitigation program. 250 independent experts analysed around 50,000 radiographs from around 3,000 treated patients. 5 years passed before the FDA's hold was lifted because of a second hold between 2012 and 2015, triggered by experimental animal studies showing autonomic nerve problems in mice. Monkey studies allayed these fears and anti-NGF trials were back on. This is one of them. Let's pretend that I'm a patient with painful arthritis and I want to enroll in a clinical trial. I'll have to answer some questions. Did I have a good response to non-steroidal drugs like ibuprofen? If the answer is yes, I'm out. Am I bow-legged or knock-kneed? If yes, I'm out. Do I have a meniscal injury in one of my knees? A bone cyst near a joint surface? Is my pain more than expected compared to my X-ray findings, which might suggest an insufficiency fracture? Am I a poor candidate for total joint replacement? This drug class doubles the risk of joint replacement, so if I answer yes, I'm out. Did I fail an autonomic nervous system test? Do I suffer from chronic diarrhea, urinary incontinence, dizziness or lightheadedness? Answer yes, and I'm out. If I'm in, one of 250 independent experts will analyse my X-rays and another 5,000 X-rays from another 3,000 patients. Despite all these precautions, I'd have a 3 to 4% chance of suffering accelerated joint destruction. There's a 6 out of 10 chance that my affected joint would not be the one that caused me pain in the first place. The affected joint might be my shoulder, and there would be no correlation between pain-killing effect and my accelerated joint destruction. During the 2021 meeting to decide the fate of the doomed human equivalent of Librela, a patient advocate compared the drug to contact lenses. They provide near perfect vision but must be removed, cleaned and thrown away. In other words, give us the flawed drug and we'll prevent serious side effects by acting responsibly. But this is not how it works. Dr. Suarez Almazor summed it up perfectly. I voted no. I think it is counterintuitive to use a drug for osteoarthritis that actually makes osteoarthritis worse. She also pointed out the glaringly obvious. Pain-free marathon runners do not suffer rapidly progressive osteoarthritis. Sea otters have suffered terribly because of their luxurious fur. In the early 20th century, they were nearly driven to extinction. Let's imagine an argument between an otter conservationist and a fur trader. The conservationist says we must protect them, they're important. The fur trader counters, no they're not. We've looked all over the land and found that they have no impact. But sea otters eat in the sea. They eat sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp. Marine life graze on kelp. No food. If we don't look below the surface, how can we know what's happening below the surface? There are 97 green sweets and 3 red sweets in this bowl. If we grab 8 without looking, there's a 1 in 5 chance we'll pick at least 1 red. 1 in 5. Remember this statistic, you'll need it in a minute. If accelerated joint destruction affects around 3% of dogs, as it does in humans, we need studies which include regular independent X-ray screening of at least 100 dogs. We don't. This is what happened in Librela's clinical trials. 8 young and healthy experimental beagles had X-rays after receiving the recommended dose 1 mg/kg. X-ray findings were reported in 5 of those 8 dogs. Remember how many people were enrolled in human field trials? 17,000. 50,000 X-rays, 250 independent readers. And Librela's field trials, 276 dogs got Librela, no follow-up X-rays, no independent readers. We brought this to the attention of the publishing journal. We referenced a study which showed severe joint destruction in rabbits treated with anti-NGF monoclonal antibodies. We referenced my own study, which described the standard classification of arthritis as mild, moderate or severe. Cartilage erosion is by definition severe pathology. We asked why Zoetis described cartilage erosion in 2 of their beagles as mild. We asked for annotated images like the ones we provided, but Zoetis declined. They did reply, I'll quote, "The Zoetis pharmacological database was most recently queried in the spring of 2024 for cases containing the terms RPOA, rapid progress fracture, radiograph, bone and joint disorder, joint pain and arthritis. Case data mirrored the expected background incidence of musculoskeletal and joint disorders. We did not identify any cases." Just to remind you, the EMA database currently contains 2,735 musculoskeletal adverse events, including 31 fractures. 29 of those fractures were already reported before Zoetis reviewed their database. I'm worried. I want Stanley's legacy to include similar safety standards for animals and humans. But I'm not the only worried expert, and this is not a lecture about my personal opinion. Dr. Lenore Buckley is a world-renowned rheumatologist from Yale School of Medicine. Like me, she protects vulnerable individuals from harm, in her case children. She asked, do we have any information about tolerance? Does that develop over time? And perhaps, as importantly, what happens when you withdraw this drug? You have patients you've taken off study, and one would wonder if you wouldn't get some kind of exacerbation, maybe even greater than their baseline pain. In other words, if this drug works miracles, it better work miracles for the rest of a patient's life, because if it accelerates arthritis, we're in big trouble if the effect wears off. Zoetis boasts of selling 14 million doses in just 3 years, but popularity is not proof of safety. If, like humans, a small proportion of dogs develop clinically silent accelerated arthritis, tens of thousands might be at risk. And what if their arthritis worsens so much that Librela can no longer control their pain? Should we add an anti-inflammatory painkiller like Rimadyl because 8 healthy experimental beagles tolerated this combination for 2 weeks? Or should we trust the far more thorough human research which shows that combining these drug types accelerates arthritis even faster? Or perhaps we should take x-rays, and what if those x-rays revealed terrible arthritis? Would we say, oh well, Librela's great but it was fighting a losing battle, or would we finally wake up and smell the coffee? Why is Librela so popular? Probably because it's a good painkiller in some dogs and a very good painkiller in others. But some of the credit must go to the significant time gap between reward and consequences. We are hardwired to prioritize immediate gratification over potential long-term risks. This is why so many people smoke, drink too much alcohol, or eat unhealthy food. If unhealthy habits or prescription drugs caused immediate harm, they wouldn't be so popular. But they don't always cause immediate harm, which is why human history is rife with tragic examples of the devastating consequences of our short-sightedness. Thalidomide, for example, was a very effective morning sickness treatment. Vioxx relieved arthritis pain, and Fen-Phen helped millions of obese people lose weight. These were all once hailed as miracle drugs, but serious delayed side effects led to their eventual bans. And we must keep this in mind when we pass judgment on Librela, when we decide if it's a hero, a villain, or like every other powerful painkiller, a bit of both.